Okay, so in the last video, I mentioned that I would bring some resources into this, and just so you can kind of know where I'm pulling the information from, because I just hit you with a bunch of history. Well, I'm going to use this one a little bit later, but this one's A Public Faith by Miroslav Volf. That's probably going to be on some of the maybe rabbit trails or commentaries on the text. This isn't directly about Romans 13, but it deals a lot with what does it look like to live our faith publicly, for example. Some of the other, well, I'm going to read off all the resources that I've used to date, and I haven't really gotten so far because I thought this was going to be cut and dry, and it wasn't. But N.T. Wright, Paul for Everyone, Romans Part 2, chapters 9 through 16, so that's one of the books that I use. And then the New American Commentary, Romans, and that's by Robert Mounts, and I'm sure I probably pronounced his last name wrong, but that's what that looks like. And I'm holding up my phone because I use Logos, which is Bible software, and these are some of the different commentaries that I have. And then Romans, a New Translation with Introduction and Commentary by Joseph Fitzmyer. So that's what that one looks like. The Gospel of God, Romans, and that's by R.C. Sproul. And then because like I said, I use the Bible software, I have a cool little tool called a passage guide. And so it kind of says from all the resources I have or different ways that things connect, I use that as well. And that's by Logos. So you can kind of see, like, it lists out all my different commentaries, and then it talks about various like cross references and passages that are involved with Romans 13. So that's a helpful little tool that I can utilize, which is I love. And then I use the IVP Bible Background Commentary for the New Testament, and that's by Craig Keener. And that one's really helpful because it brings some context to what things would have looked like for the recipients or for the author of various books within, or letters within the New Testament or the books. So that's what that one looks like. And then the Epistles to the Romans, Douglas Moo. That is what that one looks like. And then Holman New Testament Commentary, Romans, and that's by Kenneth Boa and William Krudenier. Maybe. Sorry, William, if you ever watch this, my bad on your last name. So yeah, and that's what that one looks like right there. So the reason why I want to share those resources with you is because not so that it can be like, oh, dang, Sean's such a great scholar. Not at all. What it is to say that, as I mentioned in my first video, I don't feel like I can definitely communicate any of this stuff, or like it's just something that I can just pull out of my lunch pail and be like, well, enjoy this delicious meal. I'm getting this from all these resources, and I'm trying to piece it together so it makes sense for me. But obviously with anything that we read or interact with, we can get it wrong. And so I try to have a variety of different perspectives and different traditions so I can kind of come up with something. But I'm giving you these resources, at least their names of them. Giving them to you would be super expensive, but I'm giving you these resources so that way you can at least know my source material, so that way you can check it out on your own time. I'm going to try as best as possible to attribute what I say to the respective authors and thinkers. I'm sure I'll make a mistake, and if I do and somebody catches it, please let me know, and I'll make sure to attribute that work. It's really important. But in saying that these are not my own ideas or my own work, it's true. This is the work of others, but that doesn't mean that they're right or that I'm right. It just means that at least there's people that are PhD authors, not a guy like me. And so I encourage you to do more research. I'm hoping that I can interact with some more commentaries and various things, and commentaries just being people that have really been in that area of study for a really long time, and so feel comfortable with the original languages and also texts that were written around that time within the original languages. So anyway, so those are the resources as promised, and if I don't think I've missed any, but if I have, then I'll be sure to include those at a later time. So now you sat through 2 videos and 4 minutes and 38 seconds of me saying a bunch of different stuff, and I haven't even gotten to the text, although we have read it. Romans 13, verse 1 says, I'm going to read the New Revised Standard Version again, just so that way we can hit that. It says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. I'm going to do the New American Standard Bible as well. In this one, it says, every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. When I was reading the text, it was actually really helpful to break up this verse into two different parts, like a part A and a part B. At least in the New Revised Standard Version, I think, I'm just going to look at it real quick. I believe, yeah, so there's a semicolon. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, semicolon. For there is no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. So it's just, one long sentence, but I think it's saying some important things that are really helpful. One of which is that first, so part A, which is the first part where that semicolon, in front of the semicolon, says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. And so it's helpful, first and foremost, at least for me, to understand that that's a command. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. So let's talk about that for a second. R.C. Sproul, in the book that I showed you before the commentary, says that authority means that one has the right to impose obligations, to issue commands which others are responsible and morally accountable to obey. So I'm going to read that again. Authority means that one has the right to impose obligations, to issue commands which others are responsible and morally accountable to obey. So in his work, he's just pointing out what is in the sense of general authority, right? Let every person be subject to the governing authority. So authority, the right to impose obligations, to issue commands which are responsible and morally accountable to obey. Morally is tricky, but let's go with that definition, which others are responsible and morally accountable to obey. I think R.C. Sproul, hopefully not without putting words in his mouth, at least from my understanding and reading his work, is that it becomes morally because it's something that God instituted through that particular governing body. So in that way, it definitely makes sense. But again, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, or every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities. That sounds even more like a command. And then the Common English Bible says, every person should place themselves under the authority of the government. So just, a variety of ways to express it. And in the text, R.C. Sproul, in his book, really talks a lot, and I had to read it a few times, and I'm not 100% sure that I'm going to do this justice, but basically he talked about authority of the government as it relates to power, and then power as it relates to force. So the government and authority is instituted and it's in place, whether it's a democracy or oligarchy or whatever sort of governing body is instituted at that time. With the Roman Empire, we know that there was an emperor, and there was things like emperor worship and that kind of thing. But at that particular time, that was the case, and we live in the United States, at least, in a democracy, and so our governing body and our governing authority looks very, very different. We have a national level, and then we have a local level, and then we even have community levels, and government doesn't just mean the various branches that we have. It can also, I think, in some ways be just authority in general in our life, but in this particular text, it's really, really specific about governing authority. So I think there's many other things in our lives that I experience where there's power and that there's force, but here it's really just about sort of the systems and structures of governing and authorities. And so let me go back because I feel like a rabbit trail for a minute, but just to say that when R.C. Sproul is talking about authority, and then he's talking about governing authority, and then he's talking about power, he's saying one of the essential pieces of power, is that they have one has the ability for force. And so his definition of power is government is force, meaning that the government is force and that it alone has the right to use coercion to bring people into certain patterns of behavior. So government systems and structures, therefore power, therefore force. So if you don't have force in some form or fashion where you can coerce the behavior then you don't have power. And if you don't have power, then you're not a governing authority. It makes sense, right? Force is sort of a tricky thing because I know, at least for me, being hyper independent sometimes, the government is a force that it alone has the right to coerce. And I'm like, as soon as I hear coerce, I'm like, oh no, to bring or to use coercion to bring people into certain patterns of behavior. And that can certainly be interpreted in a negative way, but it could also be interpreted in a positive way. I guess there's different forms of coercion. I'm not sure what word I would use differently, but it's just to say that when Paul is writing, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, it's helpful to be mindful of the fact that authority it means power and it means force, and that there's healthy ways to use power and there's unhealthy ways to use power. There's healthy ways to use force and there's unhealthy ways to use force. One of the things that so let's go to the second part. For there is no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. So just some critical points there. There is no power or authority that is beyond the gaze and permission of God. So there's nothing that God was like, oh, you caught me off guard with that one, Hitler. Like that's a really extreme example, but I think that's one of the things that we can wrestle with when we talk about authority and powers. And where we can push back in our relationship with God, like how would you let that happen? Like the goodness of God and then our experiential evil here on earth. But it's to say that what the second part says is, for there is no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. So that means there is no power or authority that is beyond the gaze and permission of God. So God sees it and in his infinite wisdom gives the authority and rule permission to rule in that way. So then we have to start. I know Luther, because we're in a Lutheran context, one of the things that he talks about is the two kingdom theology. And there's so many practical outworkings of this in Luther's theology. But it was just to say that, I didn't write down the source for this one. I'm going to write myself a note to find the source. Keep on going. The two parts of the two kingdom theology is that there's things that are heavenly and there's things that are earthly. And so things that are heavenly are Christian, and then things that are earthly would be considered non-Christian. So for Jesus followers, they're subject to both in the sense of, like in a very clear and literal sense, is like we live in the kingdom of God, but we're also subject to the earthly authority. So I think hopefully I'm going to do Luther justice to this. I think one of his points was, and this is not even his original thought, he's building off of the work of his predecessors, is the idea, Augustine, in the City of God, I think it was. But anyway, he's building on the idea that yes, followers of Jesus are under the authority and the reign and rule and power, and if we wanted to even say force, which is a tricky word because God is loving, but under the infinite wisdom and power of God. He is our King, right? King Jesus, Prince of Peace, all of these things that you may be familiar with. But then there are those that do not know Christ. And I think in the readings that I've seen, there's kind of a sliding scale of what that looks like. And some people use, like I tend to use the language pre-Christians, but then there's some people that say wicked and evil. And certainly there are those that are obviously wicked and evil. And those are those that are certainly in sin and sinful, and they're going in a direction that's away from God, against God even. But what he's just saying is that the authority, the governing authorities, the structures and systems here on earth are put in place so that way it doesn't become completely out of control. It's a temporal authority to restrain evil done by non-Christians. What's tricky about that? We know very well that followers of Christ, as they've labeled themselves, Jesus followers, Christians, have done absolutely evil things and have even used the powers and structures of government to do it. But I think, at least in sort of the, pie in the sky objective understanding of the two kingdom theology, is the idea that there are things that are heavenly, and that's the kingdom, but then there's also a temporal authority to prevent evil from being done. And therefore, if that's the case, the responsibility of humanity to authority, and which we can see here, is that if God, it's not beyond his power or authority or beyond his gaze or permission, that then we are responsible, whether Christian or not Christian, to submit to that authority and recognize that we are, as I think Douglas Moo said in his, that we are to recognize that we are subordinate in a subordinate place in a hierarchy. So that means that we recognize that there are certain hierarchies at play, and it's ultimately to restrain evil from going forth. And immediately we can get in all sort of rabbit trails. But for there is no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. So our responsibility is ultimately, at least from Douglas Moo's perspective, right, is to recognize to submit by recognizing our subordinate roles in hierarchy. And so ultimately we submit to the higher levels of the hierarchy because we believe that they will protect us from evil that could be perpetuated in society and culture. Whew. I'm already at 60 minutes. I'll end with this. Fitzmyer, who's one of the person that writes, notes that this has a supposition. So Paul would have been writing with a supposition or an idea already at play, which is that civil authorities, so those governing authorities that have power and force, are good and are conducting themselves rightly. Paul doesn't envisage the possibility of either totalitarian or tyrannical government. I question that because I'm like, Paul was living in an empire, so this idea of tyranny, but it was a relatively peaceful time, even though they were subjugated people. But at least for Fitzmyer's perspective, when Paul's writing this, where it says, let every person, so the command of let every person be subject to the governing authorities, and that there is no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God, he's looking at it from the broader perspective that those authorities, the civil authorities, will be good, and they will do right things. And that in some way or some fashion, that he can't imagine a totalitarian, evil governing authority, or tyrannical, that's forceful. So let me leave it there, and I'll just pause there so that way if you have questions, I really want to keep going because I'm like in a groove, but I'm going to leave it here because I want you to be able to interact with it, and I think that that's going to be helpful. So love you, and can't wait to hear your thoughts and stuff like that, and then we can keep on unpacking that. I'm just giving a basis for verse 1, and then I'm going to talk in the next video after maybe I clarify anything, some helpful principles from R.C. Sproul that really helped me in understanding even verse 1 as sort of a foundation for everything else that we're going to read ahead. Okay, so bye.